My name is David, and I'm an Uber driver in Chicago. Every day I meet a lot of different people, from young students to businessmen, from tourists to locals. My job is simple: pick up passengers and take them to their destination. But one night changed everything I knew about this job. It was an ordinary chilly October night. I accepted a request from a passenger named Sarah. Her address was in a remote part of the city, where I rarely went. As always, I entered the address into the navigator and drove off. Upon arrival, I saw an old abandoned house, illuminated only by moonlight. It was dark and quiet around, like a cemetery. I called Sarah to let her know I was there, but there was no answer. Waiting in such a creepy atmosphere seemed like an eternity. After a few minutes, when I was about to leave, a girl approached my car. Sarah was young, about 20, with dark hair and pale skin. Her eyes were large and deep, but there was something disturbing in them. She silently got into the back seat and quietly asked to go to North Avenue. I heard a slight chill in her voice, but didn't pay much attention to it. During our trip, I tried to make small talk to ease the tension. "How's your evening, Sarah?" I asked. She was silent for a long time before answering. "This is my last evening here. I don't want to stay in this city anymore." Her words seemed strange to me, but I didn't dare ask further. We continued driving through the deserted streets of Chicago. Suddenly she said, "Stop here. I want to get out." The place was far from where she initially asked to go. It was another abandoned part of the city. I stopped the car and she quickly got out without leaving any payment. I wanted to call after her, but something inside me stopped me. The next day I couldn't stop thinking about Sarah. Her pale face and those strange words wouldn't leave my mind. I decided to find her house to return the bag she had left on the back seat. It was just an excuse because I wanted to understand what happened that night. When I arrived at that old house again, it looked even more abandoned. I approached the door and knocked. After a while, an old man opened the door. "Excuse me, I'm looking for Sarah. Did she live here?" I asked. His face became sad, and he replied, "Sarah died many years ago. She was my daughter. She died in a car accident when she was coming home from her friend. Her death was a tragedy for us." My blood froze in my veins. This couldn't be true. I saw her last night, talked to her. The old man, seeing my reaction, asked, "Why are you asking about her?" I briefly told him about our night meeting and how she disappeared without a trace. His face changed. He looked like he didn't believe me, but at the same time, he was scared. The next few days, I couldn't sleep. I was haunted by dreams of Sarah, that creepy night. I constantly saw her face in front of me. One day I received another request from the same area. I didn't want to go, but a job is a job. I accepted the request. When I arrived at the place, a girl approached my car again. She looked very much like Sarah, but her eyes were even more empty. She got into the back seat and said, "I know you tried to find me. You better forget about it." Her voice was cold as ice. I felt fear creeping into my heart. We drove in silence, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. When we reached the destination, she quietly said, "Your curiosity could destroy you." She got out of the car, disappearing into the darkness, and I was left alone. I realized it was a sign. I never returned to that area again, never accepted requests from there. But every night when I get behind the wheel, I feel her presence. Sarah stays with me, her shadow haunts me, and I know one day she will come back. Now I live with this fear every day. I see her in every passenger, in every shadowy figure on the street. And every time I hear a new request notification, my heart tightens with fear. Is it her again? Is it my cursed route again? I live in New York, a city that never sleeps. But this evening I felt tired and exhausted after a long workday. I finished late and decided to call an Uber to get home faster. I usually take the subway, but this time I wanted a bit of comfort. The driver named Henry responded to my request. His profile showed a high rating, and the car was described as a clean and comfortable sedan. A few minutes later, a black car pulled up, and I got into the back seat. Henry was a friendly man around 40 years old. He asked how my day had been, and we started chatting about everyday things. Everything seemed normal, but after a few minutes, I began to feel a strange tension. We were driving through the city's main streets when I noticed Henry frequently glancing in the rearview mirror. His eyes seemed uneasy, and he was clearly looking for something behind us. I asked if everything was all right, but he just nervously smiled and said it was. Suddenly, Henry braked sharply, and I almost hit my head on the front seat. In front of us stood a man in an old suit, looking like he had stepped out of the past. He just stood in the road, staring straight at us. Henry seemed to know him because his face turned pale and his hands started trembling. The man slowly approached the car and got into the front seat without asking for permission. They started a quiet conversation, which I could barely hear. Henry addressed him as an old acquaintance but looked scared. I felt something was wrong and tried to find out who this man was, but both ignored my questions. The car started moving again, but now we were heading in an unknown direction. I began to get nervous as we were moving farther away from my home. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore and told Henry to stop the car. He looked at me with despair in his eyes and said he couldn't do that. The unknown passenger, who now seemed more real than I initially thought, started talking about some old events, revenge, and forgiveness. Suddenly, the man in the suit turned to me and said, "You will see what I saw." At that moment, the car passed by an old abandoned building. A cold chill came out of nowhere, seeping into my bones. I began to realize this passenger was not alive. Henry sharply turned into a side street and stopped in front of an old house. He told me to get out, but I refused. Then the man in the suit turned to me with a look I would never forget and whispered, "You are now one of us." At that moment, I felt the cold creeping into me from the inside, and everything around me started to fade. I woke up in the same place, but the car and passengers were gone. There was no one around, just the old abandoned building, which looked even more eerie in the night darkness. I quickly took out my phone to call the police, but the battery was dead. Leaving the place, I walked to the nearest gas station and called my friends to pick me up. This event left an indelible mark on my life. Since then, I have never used taxi services at night, and although many people don't believe my story, I know one thing. Sometimes we encounter things we cannot explain, and this encounter can change our lives forever. My name is Brian, and I work as an Uber driver. This job has not only been a source of income for me, but also an opportunity to see different parts of the city and meet interesting people. However, one night changed my attitude towards this job forever. It was a typical Friday evening. I usually worked late into the night because that's when I could earn more. I received another ride request from one of the most dangerous parts of the city, but it didn't scare me. I had been there many times and knew how to avoid trouble. When I arrived at the pickup location, a man in a dark coat and hat was waiting for me. His face was partially hidden in shadow, but I noticed that he looked very tired and anxious. He quickly got into the car and gave me an address I had never heard of before. It was an old, forgotten part of the city where almost no one lived. "Good evening. Where to?" I asked, trying to start a conversation. "Just drive," he replied curtly, not taking his eyes off the window. The road was quiet, and the only sound was the hum of the engine and the rain tapping on the car roof. The man remained silent, and I began to feel an uneasy tension. He looked like something was seriously bothering him. I decided not to ask unnecessary questions and just kept driving. After a while, we reached the old neighborhood. The houses here were abandoned and dilapidated, the streets overgrown with weeds, and the air carried a sense of neglect. My passenger suddenly asked me to stop near one of the houses. It looked like a real ghost from the past, with broken windows and doors creaking in the wind. "Wait here," he said, getting out of the car. I stayed in the car and waited. Minutes passed, which felt like hours. The street was completely empty, and I started to get nervous. My phone suddenly rang. It was my friend, who also worked as an Uber driver. "Brian, be careful. I heard strange things have been happening in that area lately," he said. "Don't worry, I'm almost done," I replied, trying to hide my concern. My passenger returned, and we continued our journey. He was silent again, but now I felt that something was really wrong. He looked even more tense, and his hands were trembling. Suddenly, he asked me to stop near an old motel, which looked abandoned and grim. He got out of the car again, leaving me waiting. My heart began to beat faster. Time passed, but the man didn't return. I decided to get out of the car and see what was happening. As I approached the motel, I heard a quiet whisper. It was my passenger. He was standing in the hallway, holding some old artifact that looked very sinister. "What is that?" I asked, trying to understand what was going on. "It's a curse," he whispered. "I have to destroy it, or it will take my life." Suddenly, the light in the hallway started flickering, and I felt a chill run down my spine. The man threw the artifact on the ground and began to pray. I didn't know what to do, so I decided to return to the car. But when I got back, the doors were locked. "Brian, help me!" he shouted, but I couldn't save him anymore. The light went out, and I heard a terrifying scream that echoed in my ears. I rushed back to the car and drove away without looking back. When I stopped to call the police, I noticed that in the rearview mirror I saw the reflection of that man. He was no longer alive. That night changed me forever. I never return to that area and always check who I pick up. But one thing I know for sure: some things are better left in the past. I always thought that working as an Uber driver in a big city was a way to make some money, meet interesting people, and see different parts of the city. My shift started in the evening when the city came alive with lights and bustle. But one night changed my perception of this job forever. It was a regular evening in New York City. I picked up a few passengers and dropped them off in various parts of the city. It was almost midnight when I received a new request. The passenger was waiting in a remote area where taxis were rarely seen. The area was notorious for its bad reputation, but I couldn't afford to decline the fare. As I approached the specified address, I saw a man in a dark coat standing under a flickering street lamp. He looked uncertain and a bit frightened. I stopped the car and he quickly got into the back seat. "Good evening," I said, trying to be friendly. "Where do you need to go?" "Central Park, please," he replied briefly, not even looking at me. His voice was quiet and slightly trembling. I felt that something was wrong, but decided not to ask unnecessary questions. The ride started as usual, but the further we drove, the more I felt a strange chill in the car. It was odd, considering I had the heater on. Driving down one of the dark side streets, I suddenly noticed in the rearview mirror that the passenger was staring at me with wide-open eyes. It was a creepy look that made me feel uncomfortable. "Is everything okay?" I asked, trying to stay calm. "Sorry to bother you," he said. "Do you believe in ghosts?" I didn't know what to say. This topic had always been something from the realm of fiction for me. "Not really," I said after a short pause. "Why do you ask?" "Because I am one of them," the passenger said quietly. My heart started to race. I couldn't believe my ears. This was either a very bad joke or the beginning of something horrible. I decided to stop the car. "Are you kidding?" I asked, turning to him. But the passenger had disappeared. In his place was only darkness and cold. My car was empty. Panic gripped me. I quickly looked in the rearview mirror again and saw something terrifying. His face, pale and distorted, staring at me from the back seat. This was impossible, as a few seconds ago he wasn't there. I screamed and got out of the car, leaving it on the side of the road. The street was empty, and only the sound of my heavy breathing disturbed the silence. I couldn't understand what had happened. My mind tried to find a logical explanation, but nothing made sense. Gathering my thoughts, I returned to the car. The passenger was still gone, but I noticed that the back seat was covered with a thin layer of frost. This was impossible, considering the heater was still on. I decided to go home. My shift was over, and I didn't want to know anything more about this night. But when I got to my apartment building, I realized that it wasn't over. On the rearview mirror appeared a message that looked like frost marks. "You are next." I couldn't believe my eyes. This was a nightmare I couldn't explain. I decided not to stay in the car and hurried to my apartment. But even there, I didn't feel safe. Every sound and shadow seemed threatening. The next day, I decided not to tell anyone what had happened. Who would believe me? I decided it was just a terrible dream, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. A few days later, I returned to work, hoping everything would be as usual. But every time I picked up a new passenger, I feared seeing the same face in the rearview mirror. My fear grew stronger, and I realized that this night had changed me forever. One day, I decided to share my story with my colleagues. They took it as a fiction, but one of them shared a similar story. It turned out that I wasn't the only one who had encountered this night passenger. Several drivers had told stories about a man in a dark coat who disappeared without a trace. This story was the last straw for me. I decided to quit my job as an Uber driver and find a safer occupation. But even now, when I think about that night, I am gripped by fear. Maybe this passenger still roams the night streets, looking for a new victim. Do you believe in ghosts? After that night, I can no longer say no.